On May 25th, 2020, when Minneapolis police officer Derek Chauvin killed George Floyd by kneeling on his neck for 8 minutes, many Americans asked, how could this happen? Many of us vowed to never let it happen again. Hello, my name is Brian Brown, and this is my series on structural racism in the United States for the East Hampton Public Schools. Racism is our problem to solve, and to solve it we have to work together. In order to fight racism, first we have to understand it. Today's lecture is about Jim Crow. As a quick recap from last lecture, the United States fought a civil war. That civil war was fought largely over slavery. Southern states left the Union in order to continue to practice slavery. We fought the war, they lost. And Reconstruction was the period immediately after the Civil War where the United States federal government tried to put the country back together. This was a unique time for African Americans in that, first of all, the 13th Amendment ended slavery. That was pretty amazing news. And so the 14th Amendment brings in full citizenship rights and equal protection under the law for African Americans who had formerly been slaves. All right. Also an incredible law. The 15th Amendment is also passed during Reconstruction, and the 15th Amendment grants black men the right to vote. Again, a very controversial topic in that it's the first time that it designates voting protection to be for men, manhood suffrage in America. Again, I highly recommend that you look it up and learn about it. During this period in time, African Americans were represented in Congress, in the Senate, even in the governor's seat for a brief period. They were able to practice the right to vote, men were, serve on juries and things like that. And serious advances were made in society. At the same time, the powerful white Southern elite who were trying to keep things going as they were, whose entire existence, their wealth, their power, their comfort, everything depended upon the free labor of enslaved human beings. They were trying to establish things back to slavery times as best as possible. And so we see black codes and the start of the convict lease system, whereby through a loophole in the 13th Amendment, black people were arrested and basically forced back into slavery for being vagrants, not having homes after they and many generations of their family had been enslaved. Of course, they weren't going to stick around at the place where they had been enslaved. But anyway, that's the last lecture. If you haven't had a chance to check it out, do. So, today's story is about Jim Crow. Okay? When people think of segregation in the South, when you think of the Civil Rights Movement and what people were fighting against in that, it's Jim Crow that you're thinking about. So Jim Crow was a period from 1877 to 1965 in which the Southern states, the former Confederate states, were very clearly segregated in a system of racial apartheid, and where any gains that had been made politically or just as far as general American rights go for African Americans were stripped away, creating basically a two-tiered system in the South where black people were second-class citizens in the land of their origin, in their homeland, in the land of their birth. So, segregation, how did it come to be? Well, legal segregation in the South goes back to a Supreme Court case which is known as Plessy versus Ferguson from 1896. Okay, so what's the story behind the case? Homer Plessy lived in Louisiana. Louisiana had a law from 1890 that said that first-class cars on trains would be white only. Homer Plessy was African American and identified as black. More on that in a minute. He bought a ticket for a first-class ticket for a train that he was going to board in Louisiana. He got on the first-class car. Somebody on the train said, black people can't be on this train. He was told to move back to the black car. He refused, was arrested, and they basically challenged it all the way up to the Supreme Court. Now, the 14th Amendment to the Constitution, Section 1 of it here, says, all persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and the state wherein they reside. No state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States, nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, property without due process of law, nor deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. All right, what this is basically saying is that states can't take away people's rights, that everybody is equal and the state has to treat everyone like they're equal. Everyone has equal protection of the laws. If the law says that you have this right, you have this right. Everyone has this right. So, Homer Plessy reads this, feels that he has this right. This is an action, by the way. This was a planned action. They knew that he was going to be refused to ride on the car. They knew that he was going to get arrested. They were trying to challenge the law because that's the way that the law works. All right. In order to challenge a law to see if it's constitutional or not, you have to have a case. It has to go before a judge, and eventually, it can go all the way up to the Supreme Court to decide whether a law is illegal or not. So they're trying to challenge the law. That's what they do. This is a 7-1 decision, so one of the judges didn't vote on it. 7-1 decision, as I've already told you, in favor of segregation. Okay, and what the court argued was that we have to protect people's access to equal facilities. But that doesn't mean that states can't discriminate between people, that they can't distinguish between the races. So the phrase that really typifies, that sums up what this ruling is all about, is separate but equal. The idea that a state can have separate facilities for black and white as long as those are equal. Now, this is going to come up very big in the 1954 case of Brown versus the Board of Education, which we'll look at a couple lectures from now, okay? Which desegregates public schools, okay? The one abstaining judge, by the way, said that basically if this is allowed to stand, then African Americans are going to have no recourse. They're going to have no way to keep from being cut out of society in every way, which was correct. So I did want to say something quickly about Homer Plessy, because it does teach about an aspect of race in America that a lot of people don't know about. And that has to do with the idea of the one-drop rule. Okay? So what does it mean to be an African American? What does it mean to be black, white? What does race mean? Perhaps you've heard the phrase that race is a social construct. It's something that we made up. And deciding who's of what race is somewhat arbitrary. But it matters in an enormous way. And hopefully you're seeing this. Some of you may not see this yet, but really hang in there. I want you to be able to see that race really, really matters in America, and sort of why. So the one-drop rule basically says this. It has been customary in America that if you have any African American ancestry, then you are considered African American, that you're considered black. All right, one drop of black blood is the way that people talk about it. sort of an archaic way of looking at things. But anyway, take for a perfect example, President Obama. President Obama is sort of agreed upon as the first black president of the United States. President Obama identifies as black. Everyone identifies President Obama as black. That's fine. President Obama's father is black and his mother is white. And, so people aren't like, well, he's just a white president because, 50% of his ancestry is white, et cetera, et cetera. So the one drop rule comes up with Homer Plessy because Homer Plessy has 7 white great-grandparents and 1 black great-grandparent. Okay, so that's to the extent that he is black. But under the one drop rule, he is black. So Homer Plessy, and so there's an enormous amount. If you're looking to understand more subtle things about race relations in America and in other countries as well, there's a lot of literature out there. There's a lot of people talking about the idea of passing as white. So the difference in ways people are treated if they're dark-skinned or light-skinned, so on and so forth. These are really interesting things for you to educate yourself on or to seek an education on. All right, not really into the scope of this, but I just wanted to sort of point out to it because it is sort of interesting that Homer Plessy having 1 great-grandparent who's black, but still being considered black. Okay? All right. Anyway, so that's legal segregation. The South takes this case and they run with it. They're like, okay, separate but equal, we're on it. And so schools are desegregated, schools are segregated, jobs are segregated, neighborhoods, housing, where you live, any opportunity basically, anything that they can segregate, they do. All right? This pool is for black people only, this pool is for white people only, and this restaurant, black people can't eat here, or if they can only eat in one place. Entrances, we've heard about a lot of this stuff. This is really sort of typifies what we think of as the South, and so it's Plessy versus Ferguson, the Supreme Court case in 1896 that basically makes segregation legal. And like I said, Southern states run with it. Okay? I talked about this last time. I talked about this in the introduction. All right, we're talking about racism. Racism being different from bias in that racism has this element of power in it. Okay, so if this small group of powerful white elites in the South are maintaining their power situation, all right, through segregation and stuff like that, they have a serious threat because African Americans can now run for political office. African American men can. They can vote. So they can vote for a black candidate or a white candidate who's against segregation. They can serve on juries. So when people are accused of atrocious and untrue things and so on and so forth, they can represent their peers and things like that. All right. There's going to be a large focus on criminal justice in sort of the second half of the series. So we'll get to all that stuff. All right. This is a serious existential threat to racism, societal racism. Okay. And so Southerners have to figure out a way to keep black people from exercising their rights as American citizens. Okay? And so as a result, they put up all sorts of barriers in society. All right? Barriers to prevent people from voting. If you can't register to vote, then your name is not going to be on a juror list. So by cutting out black people from registering to vote, they're also cutting out black people from being able to serve on juries. And of course, and to run for political office as well. Now, a lot of what's used is intimidation. Intimidation is actually going to be the topic of our next lecture. All right, so sort of keep that in mind, that the next lecture is going to be about violence. It's going to be about intimidation. It's some heavy stuff, but it's really, really, really important stuff. And it's important to know how recent, how extremely recent this we're talking about. All right. So these barriers. These barriers have to do with registering to vote. Now, down south, they had a couple main barriers from registering to vote. These were poll taxes and literacy tests. All right. So a poll tax is a fee that you have to pay to register to vote. Okay. These are eventually abolished in the 1960s, but at this time they exist. And so that's a barrier for some people to be able to vote. All right. A literacy test is a test that's supposed to make sure that somebody is basically smart enough to get to vote. Now, there's nothing in the Constitution that says that you have to be smart to vote. That's not part of the protection. There's no clause there that qualifies that. Okay, but they put this in. All right. Now, wouldn't it stand to reason that there are a bunch of poor white people who can't pay a poll tax either? Yes, that is true. All right. Wouldn't it stand to reason that there are uneducated white people as well who could not pass a literacy test? Absolutely. Okay. And this comes down to a phrase that you may have heard before, and you might not know what its origins are or sort of where it comes from. All right. And that phrase is grandfather clause. Okay. And so when these laws were being written that said, yeah, you can register to vote in Alabama, but you have to pay a poll tax, or yeah, you can register to vote in Mississippi, but you have to pass a literacy test, sort of down the law a little bit, it would say, if your grandfather was eligible to vote in Alabama, in Mississippi, in Georgia, right, you can register to vote. You don't have to pay the poll tax, or you don't have to take the literacy test. Okay, so that's what a grandfather clause means. It means that this idea of if your grandfather could vote, then you're good. All right. Now, the problem being that these laws being passed very soon after the end of slavery is that black people's grandfathers probably couldn't vote. All right, and so this is a way of saying it's okay, poor white people. All right, you can still vote. And, politicians using poor white people and poor black people against each other as a long story. It's an old story. I'm tempted to get into it here, but we're not gonna. Okay, we're not gonna get into it here. So, also, the people who registered you to vote are the ones who decided whether or not you paid the poll tax or whether or not you took the literacy test. And so, if a white person comes up and they want to register to vote, they were allowed to register to vote. If black people show up to register to vote, they're told they have to do the poll tax or take a literacy test. Now, is it a bad idea to have to make sure that somebody's literate? We want people to be literate in society. All right, it's sort of a weird way to enforce it, but is there any legitimacy to this? All right, so I would say no, and that's as simple as that. But let's take a look at some of the questions from these literacy tests. So, quick story. When I was in graduate school, so I'm a high school history teacher. When I was in graduate school getting my master's, I was in a class with a bunch of other people who were also getting their master's in teaching history. And in this one class, we were given a literacy test. I believe it was the Alabama literacy test. And we weren't told what it was, but we were told that we had to, take it. But we were allowed to take it in groups. And we took it, we submitted it. They graded them, they gave it back to us, and then they told us what it was. Now remember, we were all people who were seeking advanced degrees. We already had a high school diploma, we already had a bachelor's degree. We were seeking an advanced degree specifically in the teaching of history. Of the 7 groups, I believe, that took it, only one passed. It was my group. I gotta claim that, right? We got it. We were fine. All right. But still, so of all these groups of people with really, whatever, we all went to college, expensive educations. Even we couldn't pass this thing. All right. And this was given to anybody who showed up. All right, the school system for African Americans in the South and in the North were really, really bad. Right. So I'm going to read you some questions from some literacy tests, and you can think for yourself about whether or not you think that these are things that people should be asked to see if they're qualified to vote, or if these are things that are being asked to throw up a barrier for people to be able to vote. All right, see how you do. All right, so let's see. I think the first two questions come from Alabama. All right, see how you do. Say it out loud. See how you do. Name the United States Attorney General. Another one, can you be imprisoned under Alabama law for debt? All right, maybe you can answer those. Let's see, Georgia. All right, these are a couple from Georgia. If the governor of Georgia dies, who succeeds him? And if both the governor and that person dies, who exercises executive power? You know, for somebody whose job it is to like make assessments and stuff like that, this is tricky not only in what it asks you to know, but then you have to know what it means to exercise executive power. They could have just said, who's the governor now? But they didn't, right? Here's one. See how you would do for Massachusetts or whatever state you're watching this in. Who's the Georgia Commissioner of Agriculture? Do you know who your Commissioner of Agriculture is? I don't. The ones from Louisiana are probably most notorious in that they're often worded in confusing ways. So here's one. Draw a line around the number of the letter of the sentence. Draw a line around the number or letter of this sentence. Not a circle, not a box. Draw a line around. Anyway, circle the first letter of the alphabet in this line. That's another one. Here's one. Spell backwards forwards. There's a comma, no quotation marks. Spell backwards, comma, forwards. Another one. Write the word noise backwards and place a dot over what would be its second letter should it have been written forward. Write the word noise backwards and place a dot over what would be its second letter should it have been written forward. Okay, so what I'm hoping you're seeing here is that these tests that are given, whatever, we all went to school, we all had good teachers and bad teachers. Sometimes, maybe the ridiculousness of these tests doesn't seem any more ridiculous than any test you ever took. I don't know what to say. I'm sorry if you had a bad experience, okay? But the fact that these tests were written specifically to be put up as a barrier for people to be able to vote, for people to be able to serve on juries, people to be able to run for political office, and that they were only handed out, that they were only required of black people in the South, all right? And that, on the state level, these things were written, put into law, based on a federal court ruling, okay? But that then they were exercised by town clerks or voter registrars or whoever, registers people to vote in every little town throughout the South, all right? This is a structure. So when people say this isn't just about one person being racist against another person, but that this is a whole society, that the society is structured to work in a certain way, and that way is to take the rights away from African Americans, to make things harder for black people, to give advantages to certain members of the sort of powerful white population, all right? This is what we're talking about when we say stuff like this. This isn't just about whatever, white people not being able to say the N-word when they rap along with their favorite recording artist, which you can't do. There's one thing we can't do. You should be okay with that. This isn't just about being PC or, a simple, rude comment that somebody makes, et cetera, et cetera. This is about a structure. This is about a system that is set up intentionally to keep some people from gaining full access to their citizenship. This is what we're talking about. Remember, it's our job to fight against racism. We got to recognize it. We got to see it for what it is. All right? Jim Crow in the South is a perfect example of racism at its most extreme. All right? When we talk about violence and intimidation and stuff like that, all right, it's impossible to deny that this stuff is racist. All right? The myth that we are unfortunately suffering from, a lot of us, a lot of white people in America today, is that this stuff is gone, that it doesn't matter because people aren't turning fire hoses on black people anymore. All right? They're turning them on Native Americans, protesting pipelines and stuff like that. All right? But anyway, the point is, all right, that it's not just about that overt act, but that it's about the entire structure of the system. Okay? So over the next really couple of lectures, we're going to look more at Jim Crow. We're going to look more at the structure of the South. And we're coming north, by the way. Us Yankees can have an inflated idea about race relations up here. But we're going to look at some very clear, obvious racist stuff. And it's easy to say, this stuff doesn't matter anymore. But the point that I'm trying to make, that I hope you're seeing, is that an entire society is structured from the federal level right down to town hall. And the whole system is set up in a way to oppress people. Okay? So thanks for tuning in. Next time we're going to look at intimidation. We're going to look at violence. We're going to look at lynching. It's intense, but we want to understand this now. All right? We told ourselves we want to understand this, and we can't look away anymore. Okay? Thanks for tuning in. See you in the next episode.